everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 154 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, I'm going to be Faith Hill because we're going to talk about just breathe. Yes, breathing mechanics, tips, tricks, everything you need to get your kicks when it comes to breathing, among other things. We're going to dive into some biomechanics stuff. We're going to dive into how you should breathe at rest, all types of wild and crazy things, and of course, your questions. Because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam, recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from, this one's a beast. It comes from Javi. And here's what Javi asks. Can you talk about crural/costal diaphragm fibers and their role as a compensatory influence on narrow and wide infrasternal angles? Yes, Javi, I can. It was inspired by a recent video by Daddy O'Pops himself, Bill Hartman, which I'll link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/breathing-tips. Check it out. There's going to be a blog, show notes, everything you need there to make it happen. And he talked about the difference between the costal and crural fibers of the diaphragm and narrow and infrasternal angle stuff. And I watched it, thought about it, and I've come to a conclusion. I was wrong. Gosh, what a lamer, right? I probably didn't have the mechanics as well thought out as I thought I did at least. It makes sense once I thought through what he was saying, that this is probably a better and more accurate explanation of what's going on with each of the infrasternal angle archetypes. And I think once I explain it good to you, it will make a lot more sense as to why he is explaining the diaphragm differences in this manner. The big issue with the way I was thinking about diaphragm movement and dynamics before was I was operating under the guise that muscles contract as one piece. And that's not necessarily true. There's this cool study that will be in the show notes that was called this, that I think you'll find interesting. I would definitely give it a shot if you haven't. In vivo sarcomere lengths and sarcomere elongations are not uniform across an intact muscle. Basically what they did was they looked at different muscles in, I believe this was an animal study, from what I recall, the mouse tibialis anterior. And they looked at different components of the muscle. And they found that they could create selective contractions, shortening and lengthening within the muscle, meaning that you can have certain portions of muscles contracted versus another. This leads one to potentially believe that, oh, well, if that's the case, I could potentially have more tension on one aspect of the muscle and less tension on another aspect of the muscle. And I think practically, we might see this in some of our supreme clientele. A good example of this is after an ACL surgery, if you have someone who has limited knee extension, but they have a crazy, folks, straight leg raise. A lot of times what will happen in this case, as my son will demonstrate, or at least his leg, is you could potentially have a situation where the distal component of the hamstrings is concentrically oriented, which will limit knee extension. But the proximal component of the hamstrings could be eccentric, which will allow for your straight leg raise to move unabated. So that's a really good example of having a scenario where you could have a muscle that is concentric in one portion and eccentric in another. I think that this probably also happens at the diaphragm as well. You could theoretically break up the diaphragm into two segments. Although really, if you look at the fiber orientation, you could break it up into significantly more sections, but that's a talk for another day. Let's, for the sake of argument, break up the diaphragm into two segments. You could conceivably bisect the diaphragm in half anteriorly and posteriorly, having the attachments of the rib cage to the central tendon being one portion of it, and the other portion being the low back to central tendon attachment points. And if we were to selectively contract these areas, we would see some interesting things occur. We could see the anterior portion of the diaphragm be more concentric in certain cases, and the posterior be eccentric, and vice versa. Now you might be wondering, Zach, what are those cases? Well, I'm glad you asked. That's where I think we could look at our infrasternal angle presentations to determine who is what. In the wide infrasternal angle archetype, what we see is we see an increased, generally, not always, but an increased lumbar lordosis, which is an exhaled orientation of the lumbar spine, and we see a inhaled bucket handle position, or the infrasternal angle is wide, which is associated with inhalation. So there we have an exhaled orientation of the spine and an inhaled orientation of the lower rib cage. So then you might wonder, how does that manifest at the diaphragm? Well, folks, if the lumbar spine is in an exhaled orientation, and we know that the crural fibers of the diaphragm attach at the lumbar spine between L1 and L4, and it is asymmetrical, we could reason to believe that the posterior portion, or the crural portion of the diaphragm, likely has more eccentric orientation. And if we look at the front side of the anterior aspect of the diaphragm, since the bucket handle is up, the ISA is wide, you're breathing in, and when you inhale, the diaphragm contracts, we likely have a more concentric orientation of the diaphragm anteriorly, or the crural portion. And this intuitively makes sense based on the attachments, and also based on we have to have some capability of having concentric and eccentric orientation of the diaphragm so we can move air. If we don't have that, we can't move air. So with the wide infrasternal angle, you will have a concentric anterior diaphragm and an eccentric posterior diaphragm. Now here's the cool thing, folks. That matches what's going on with your pelvic diaphragm, aka the pelvic floor. Let's now pull my grandson to help us out. With a wide infrasternal angle archetype, we also have a wide infrapubic angle, which is associated with a nutated sacrum. If I have a nutated sacrum and a wide infrapubic angle, if you look at the anterior and posterior pelvic floor, since the pelvic floor is going to be more in a nutated and open outlet position, what you will see in that case is the posterior pelvic floor. And I know I'm making that a little bit simplistic because there's many muscles in the pelvic floor. And you probably have some differentiations once we have some asymmetrical movement. But for this archetype, the posterior pelvic floor is going to be more eccentric because the sacrum is nutated, meaning the bottom of the sacrum is going to be moving away and stretching out from midline. So it's eccentric. The anterior portion is going to be more concentric. It mirrors what's going on in the thoracic diaphragm. So the backside diaphragms are going to be more eccentric, and the front side diaphragms are going to be more concentric in the wide infrasternal angle person. Now, what's crack-a-lackin' with our narrows? Like your boy, boom. If you simply answer reverse, reverse, you would be correct. Because that's precisely what's happening with the narrow infrasternal angle presentation. With the narrow, the bucket handle is down, the infrasternal angle is narrowed, And the spine is in more of an inhaled orientation. So at the lumbar spine, it's less of a lumbar lordosis. So if I'm breathing in, it would make sense that the posterior diaphragm is likely going to be more concentric because of the alteration in the crural attachments of the diaphragm. Crural being that attaches to the lumbar spine. Since the anterior aspect of the diaphragm and the rib cage is in an exhaled orientation, the infrasternal angle is narrowed, the bucket handle is decreased. That is in more of a eccentric orientation at the diaphragm. So with the narrow infrasternal angle, I am more concentric in the back. I'm more eccentric in the front when it comes to the diaphragm attachments. Which, guess what, folks? It mirrors what happens with the pelvic floor in our narrow archetype. So in the pelvic floor for a narrow, since the sacrum is counternutated, the infrapubic angle is narrowed, you're going to have a concentric orientation posteriorly because the bottom portion of the sacrum is tipping forward. And then the anterior aspect is going to be eccentric. It's dropping down, Charlie Brown. So the diaphragms mirror each other in each of these archetypes. And that's a likely more plausible situation that's going on with each infrasternal angle. Now, I've mentioned a bunch in the past that if the diaphragm really descends and flattens, the mechanics at the rib cage would invert and problems would ensue. So could you have a situation where that is still true? And I think so. I think you could have that selectively at one aspect of the diaphragm. And this would be where we would see secondary compensation. So for example, if we know for the wide or the narrow that in the wide infrasternal angle, the anterior diaphragm is going to be more concentric, and in the narrow infrasternal angle, the posterior diaphragm is going to be more concentric. If those muscles descend further towards flat, you will see alterations in each of those respective areas. Meaning, for the wide infrasternal angle, this could be a person where if that diaphragm descends to flat, you might actually see the rib cage narrow inward. More so. It might not be completely 90 degrees or less like the narrow, but it could be that individual who has a difficult time bucket handling either direction, meaning they can't move it further out with an inhaled orientation or they can't close it down with an exhaled orientation. This would be a secondary compensation. But I still have to be able to move air, so you might not see as much change in the posterior diaphragm in the case of a wide. For a narrow infrasternal angle, we're talking things are happening at the lumbar spine. So folks, if I am breathing in and I'm getting an inhaled orientation at the lumbar spine, if the diaphragm drops down and it flattens and it creates further downward pressure into on the viscera, then if I reverse the line of pull, that would bring the spine in more of an exhaled or forward orientation, which we do see sometimes with our narrow infrasternal angle peoples. So you can still have a diaphragm that is descending and moving towards flat, but it likely is occurring more in selective areas as opposed to happening in total. And that would be my current thought process regarding the mechanics of the diaphragm. And I have to give kudos to Daddy O'Pops himself. Definitely check out the video because he does a really good job of explaining it, probably better than your boy does. So to summarize this question by my man Javi, narrow and wide infrasternal angle likely have differentiation in terms of what portion of the diaphragm is concentric, and it mirrors what's going on in the pelvic floor. So for a wide ISA, they will be concentric anteriorly, eccentric posteriorly when it comes to the diaphragm. For a narrow, reverse, they're going to be concentric posteriorly and they're going to be eccentric anteriorly. And that can likely change based on secondary compensations and with rotational actions, but to talk about it from a baseline level of our infrasternal angle peeps, that's likely what's crack-a-lackin'. The next question comes from Headhunter. Ooh, scary name. But here's what Headhunter asks. What if your lower ribs don't move upwards in the inhale at first, at least not in a bucket handle manner? So as we alluded to in the previous question, the bucket handle action is when you breathe in, the ribs are going to move outward and upward, and as you breathe out, the ribs should move downward and inward. Sometimes when you're teaching your supreme clientele to stack, so they can talk to Zach, you might not see that. Instead, what you'll see is the ribs are going to move up and down like Charlie Brown with a frown, meaning they've had a loss of bucket handle dynamics when they are breathing. And we want to do things to ensure that our supreme clientele has that so we can have a restoration of movement dynamics in the lower rib cage, because that sets the stage along with some good stuff in the pelvis to make sure you can move in multiple directions and do all types of wild and crazy things. So how do we teach our peeps to have the bucket handle action restored? There are two keys that you need to ensure that you can get the ribs to move outward and upward as you breathe in. Key number one happens during the exhale. We want our exhale to be full and complete with a little bit of ab tension created at the tail end of the exhale. And the reason why this is because if I create a little bit of ab tension at the exhale, that's going to limit the rib cage migrating superiorly when I breathe in. Think about it this way, folks. If I'm breathing in and I see the rib cage lift up as one unit, that's because my accessory muscles, so your neck muscles, your chest muscles, all types of stuff like that, are lifting the rib cage up as one unit so you can get more air in, because there has become a loss of relative motion between the ribs when I breathe in. If I create a little bit of ab tension with the obliques, not a lot, not like I'm bearing down, but I get a little bit of ab tension, that's going to limit the accessory muscle's capability of lifting the rib cage up as a unit. So you have to have that in order to ensure that the rib cage moves outward and upward. But that's not all. You also have to do everything in your power to mitigate those accessory muscles kicking in during the inhalation. So the inhalation also got to be on point. You want to make sure that your inhale is silent, it's through the nose, and there's minimal upper body tension occurring throughout. It is not uncommon for your supreme clientele, when they breathe in, to use a ton of neck. You'll see this. Ooh. Feel a little bit of neck tension just doing that. If you see the base of the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes kicking in as you inhale, it's too much. As my grandma would say, too much, really. It's too much going on. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. With both of these situations, one, a person being able to create ab tension during the exhale, and two, being able to inhale without creating tension, the first step that you need to cultivate with both of those issues is awareness. It's always the first step with most of your problems, isn't it? So when I'm coaching someone to do an exhale, I'll have them put their their hands right below their belly button. And I'll say, hey peeps, I want you to exhale, get all that out, make it smaller. And then I'll just tell them, hey, do you notice anything happening there? Or I might even say, hey, you ought to eventually notice a little bit of tension in your abs. Once they've gotten that, then I'll have them pause, keep that ab tension. Can they maintain it? If they can, cool. Then I'm going to move on to making sure they can maintain that ab tension while they breathe in. Once I've done that, then I might move on to the inhale and kind of go through the same process. If there's someone who's kicking in a lot of neck as they're breathing in, I'll say, hey, put your hands right at the base of your neck, and I want you to breathe in and notice, do your neck muscles kick in? And they'll go, oh, wow, yeah, they are kicking in on point. And I'll say, hey, fam, why don't you just try to breathe in and make sure that that stays chill? And I might just have them focus on that for a portion of time. If there's someone who can't create the normal stack breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, without engaging neck, I might circumvent them creating ab tension in the beginning, and I'll just have them focus on mouth closed, breathe through the nose, silent, easily, effortlessly, without engaging neck muscles. And once they have that and they can consistently get the inhale without the neck kicking in, I'll have them remove their hand, and then I'll throw in the exhale, making sure it's slow, drawn out, easily, and effortlessly. If someone is creating a bunch of tension when they're moving first, moving including breathing, you want to teach them to be able to create the action without the tension happening first. Because when I inhale, I need to create expansion, and if I'm expanding, I cannot have tension limiting the expansion. And that's what's happening when you breathe in. So to summarize this incredible question by Headhunter, 2 keys when you're performing the bucket handle and inhaling and you want to restore that. You need to be able to exhale enough that ab tension's created to anchor the lower rib cage. And then you have to be able to inhale with minimal tension created. That is more important than the exhale. So make sure that they inhale through their nose silently without engaging neck or chest or whatever. Focus on that first. Once you have that, then you want to cultivate awareness to them creating a full exhale, making sure the ab wall gets smaller. They create a little bit of ab tension and they maintain it throughout the breathing sequence, a pause and an inhale. If you do that, you ought to be in business. Unbelievable question, Headhunter. The last scheduled question before I get to you folks on IG comes from Jim. And here's what Jim asks. At rest, should I just breathe away? Or is there a more precise way to do it? Though it seems like you could drive yourself crazy as you analyze all 20,000 breaths in a day. I wonder who has done that. Too many of my supreme clientele. And there's a common misconception when you're coaching a lot of this stack-based breathing. Because a lot of people think, okay, well, Zach, this is how you're coaching breathing. Do you want me to do this all day, every day? And can you imagine? You're working on your computer and like trying to type your TPS reports while you're getting a full exhale. Stop. We don't want to do that. That's what the stack breathing is doing is it's encouraging an increase in movement dynamics. So we're utilizing an exaggerated breathing strategy to increase the available movement in a given activity. That's not necessarily what we want to do on a daily basis because it's just unrealistic and unnecessary. What we want to encourage on a daily basis, being careful that we're not creating obsession with this, is nasal breathing. Because when you're not talking, you're at rest, you're chilling like Bob Dylan, that's the type of breathing strategy that we typically want to employ. And there are a few different things that we want to focus on, 4 keys in fact, when we're performing nasal breathing throughout the day. And that involves the palatal tongue posture, meaning we want our mouth to be lightly closed, not like, a pouty face or duck face, nothing like that. We want the mouth lightly closed. The second thing is you want your tongue completely plastered gently to the roof of your mouth without creating any tension. You shouldn't be able to notice that you're putting the tongue up to the roof of the mouth. What that does is that seals off the oral airway. It helps create space in the throat so the pharyngeal wall doesn't collapse and allows you to breathe throughout your nose. The third thing is teeth. we want them either contacting lightly or slightly apart. It seems as though either is appropriate. And depending on who you talk to, some might argue one way or another, but I think either are okay. As long as you're not generating a lot of tension. When you're just relaxing, you don't need a lot of tension to create a relaxed position. So we want to ensure that that's the case when we're just doing our daily activities. And then the last thing, shouldn't be able to hear you breathe. It should be, when you have those three components, you should be able to breathe easily and effortlessly in and out through your nose. And that's about as far as I get with my Supreme clientele when it comes to that. Now, it might be that you could practice that and maybe you'll get better, but some people may have a hard time with that. Maybe you have some structural issues nasally that could be limiting your ability to move air in and out throughout your nose. Maybe you got a tongue tie and that needs to be cut. Maybe you don't have enough space in your mouth to create the tongue posture. Maybe your bite is off. That can be something that might need to be addressed. I have tons of posts that I'll link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/breathing-tips. Check it out. But you might have to go down that route if you've tried these things and it fails. So check out those posts, see if that helps. But the big key is not doing the stack-based breathing throughout the day. It's maintaining a palatal tongue posture and being able to breathe easily and effortlessly nasally. If you do that, no one will mess with you. Awesome question. I'm going to now go to IG, but before I do that, folks, if you're someone who needs some help with the breathing sequencing and you're like, I'm not sure how to best help with that. Or you're like, well, Zach, you didn't really talk about the pelvis. What else is involved in the stack? Well, you can learn from Zach by coming to Human Matrix, my seminar. There's going to be a bunch across the U.S. I would definitely check it out. The next one, folks, is going to be August 14th and 15th in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Definitely sign up for that. It's coming up soon. The early bird's going to end next month, so definitely sign up while you can. Other ones that'll be happening, September 25th and 26th, Wyckoff, New Jersey. October 23rd and 24th in Philly. November 6th and 7th, Charlotte, North Carolina. November 20th and 21st in Colorado Springs. And December 4th and 5th in wonderful Las Vegas, Nevada. Definitely come check it out. Links will be in the show notes. Holla at your boy. J. Curry Fitness. Tips on preventing an alien from popping out when breathing after the brace. Yes. So what's happening here is if the alien is popping out, chances are you got too much rectus, damn near kildus, abdominis on the exhale. Because what happened is when you exhale, if you create too much tension with the rectus, you exhale too forcefully, that kicks in, it creates more downward pressure into the viscera, and then that pooching out is the alien popping out. That's your abdominal contents being pushed forward. I actually did a section of the debrief where I dive into this that I will link in the show notes. But your big keys that you have to encourage before diving into this further is you got to make sure that when you exhale, the ab wall gets smaller. Drive a little bit of OA extension so you maximize the upper airway, and then select positions to ensure that that doesn't happen. If you do that and the ab tension that you maintain is more oblique, less rectus, that should mitigate the alien popping out that we often see when people breathe in. It has to be the obliques. It can't be just the rectus damn near kildus, because if that's happening, then you're not going to be able to get the expansion that you want. That will differ when you're doing more intense activities, but just to reiterate, you want obliques doing the work, not necessarily the rectus when we're talking about stacking or movement restoration based activities. Awesome question. The Unbreakable Body, great name, and I love your thumbnail. Clients who say, oh, my nose doesn't work when we talk about nose breathing. How do I help them see that their nose can work better? Yes. Some people, they actually might be not far off with that, the unbreakable body. Maybe they can't get air into their nose. So there's a few different little tweaks you can try to make that happen. And in fact, this is very common when you have someone who's got a stuffy nose. So one easy solution that you could do, that you can do right on the spot, would be have them take their fingers, have them go on the sides of your nose, spread it apart. and have them breathe in. A lot of times that will increase the space available for the nasal airway so they can breathe in through their nose a lot more easily. If that's the case and that works, you have a few different options that you could have your supreme clientele do. The cheapest option is when you're doing stacking based activities, cue the palatal tongue posture that we talked about with Jim's question and have them just hold that position as they breathe in. That can work really well. You could also have them buy different appliances that may help encourage them to nasal breathe easier. One could be Breathe Right strip. That's probably the cheapest route. It's just a strip that you put across your nose. I'll link it in the show notes. That basically recreates the spread that you do with the fingers. The next upgrade from that, and a more expensive version of that, would be the Intake, which is a magnetized version of the Breathe strip. That also works pretty well. I've had a few of my supreme clientele get that, and they love it, swear by it. I'm partial to the Mute, which is a nasal dilator that you can stick up your nose. I recently did a unboxing of the Mute, and it's pretty cool. If you go ahead and watch that, you'll be able to see the before and afters of how that increases my ability to breathe nasally. Those would be conservative options. I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a future post, but I actually had a more aggressive option done that recreates the same effect called the Vivair, which is basically like an ablation in the nostrils. In fact, I had it yesterday. And so far, I'm going to see how things go after a few months, but it basically feels like I have the Mute in right now. And I slept without the Mute last night, and it's freaking dramatic. It's absolutely dramatic. Could be something to look into. Stay tuned. I'm still vetting the process because I'm still in the healing phase of this. But that's something you could look into as well. But also a lot of the coaching that I talked about with Jim's question, you want to make sure the tongue can get to the roof of the mouth. All of that stuff can encourage nasal breathing. I would also encourage your supreme clientele to do saline washes if they aren't already, because that could potentially be useful as well. Maybe they got a bunch of gunk up there that needs to be cleaned out, and that can help. If you've exhausted those options and they still have a hard time breathing, they might have a structural issue. Get them under a good ENT to see if that can be fixed. As someone who had difficulty nasal breathing throughout my life, when I had a septoplasty done, meaning they shaved down the septum and I had my turbinates reduced, that helped my nasal breathing a ton. And it dropped my resting heart rate 10 beats per minute. So they could be true. That could be an issue that needs to be addressed. But I would try the conservative measures first, see if that helps, and then if it doesn't, you might need to kick it up a notch or Lagasse style and do something more aggressive. Awesome question. That's a good stopping point for us today. Thank you all for your questions. You've been amazing, and thank you for tuning in and supporting the fam. Again, Human Matrix, the next one is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, August 14th and 15th. Definitely come check it out. I want to thank you for tuning in. You've been amazing. I will not be debriefing next week, but folks, I'm hoping to have fingers crossed, if things work out this weekend, I'm hoping to have a dope video for you next week that I think you'll really like. I'm going to try to actually coach someone through the stack who's never been exposed to it. And it's one of my fam, like my biological fam. It's either going to be my bro, my nephew, or it's going to be one of my boys, Trey. So we'll see about that. So stay tuned. I think you'll really like it because I've had some people ask me about that. So let's see it. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I hope that you keep it real but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.